Good morning. From today's gospel reading, no disciple is superior to the teacher, but one fully trained, every disciple will be like his teacher. St. Peter Claver was a Jesuit missionary from Spain during the 17th century. He studied at the University of Barcelona. He wrote in his journal before entering the Society of Jesus, "I must dedicate myself to the service of God until death, on the understanding that I am like a slave." And as we will see, he fulfilled this promise. Peter Claver was struggling with his vocation when an elderly Jesuit befriended him, Brother Alphonsus Rodriguez, who would later be canonized on the same day as Peter by Pope Leo XIII in 1888. Rodriguez felt that God had told him that Claver would suspend his life and service in the colonies of New Spain, and he frequently urged the young student to accept this calling. Claver volunteered for the Spanish colonies and was sent to the new kingdom of Granada, where he arrived in the port city of Cartagena, now in present-day Colombia, in 1610. Cartagena was a slave trading hub, and 10,000 enslaved people poured into the port yearly, crossing the Atlantic from West Africa under conditions so foul that an estimated one-third died in transit. Although Pope Paul III condemned the slave trade and Urban VIII had issued a papal decree prohibiting slavery, it was a lucrative business and continued to flourish. After arriving in Cartagena, Claver studied theology for 6 years before being ordained a priest. During this time, Claver was introduced to his eventual mentor, Father Alonso de Sandoval. Sandoval had devoted himself to serving the slaves for 40 years before Claver's arrival, and during this time had learned the customs and languages of the Africans. Whereas Sandoval had visited the slaves where they worked, Claver preferred to head for the wharf as soon as a slave ship entered the port. Boarding the ship, he entered the disease-filled holds of the ships to treat and minister to the badly treated, terrified human cargo who had survived a voyage of several months under horrific conditions. Claver wrote that he had to force himself to go where he did not want to go. After the slaves were herded from the ship and penned in nearby yards to be scrutinized by crowds of buyers, he gave basic instructions with the help of interpreters and pictures, which he carried with him. Claver saw the slaves as fellow Christians, encouraging others to do the same as well. When slave ships were not arriving, he traveled the country, visiting plantation after plantation to give spiritual consolation to the slaves. During his 40 years of ministry, it is estimated that he taught and baptized over 300,000 slaves. He would then follow up on them to ensure they received their Christian and civil rights they deserved through their human dignity. His mission extended beyond caring for slaves, however. He preached in the city squares to sailors and traders and conducted country missions, returning every spring to visit those he had baptized, ensuring they were treated humanely. During these missions, however, whenever possible, he avoided the hospitality of the planters and overseers. Instead, he would lodge in the slave quarters. Claver's work on behalf of the slaves did not prevent him from ministering to the souls of the well-to-do members of society, traders and visitors to Cartagena, and also the condemned criminals there, many of whom he spiritually prepared for death. He was also a frequent visitor at the city's hospitals. Through years of unremitting toil and the force of his unique personality, the slave situation slowly improved. In time, he became a moral force, the apostle of Cartagena. Claver was too ill to leave his room in the last years of his life. He lingered for 4 years, largely forgotten and neglected. He died on September 8, 1654. The city magistrate, who had previously considered him a nuisance for his persistent advocacy on the behalf of the slaves, ordered a public funeral, and he was buried with pomp and ceremony. It is easy to see how St. Peter Claver lived out today's gospel message as he lived out his life as a disciple of Christ, his ultimate mentor. How he embodied the words of St. Paul from today's first reading, when Claver was quoted as saying, "We must speak to them with our hands before we try to speak with them with our lips." Claver was giving the gospel message, as St. Paul says, that when I preach, I offer the gospel free of charge. St. Peter Claver lived out his words in his journal. I must dedicate myself to the service of God until death, on the understanding that I am like a slave. Today, let us ask St. Peter Claver to pray for us, to help us go where we do not want to go, to deliver the gospel message free of charge to others, to become slaves ourselves to the service of God. St. Peter Claver, pray for us.